And it is so wonderful to have Melanie Finch with us today. So Mel is a structural and metamorphic geologist in the Economic Geology Research Centre at James Cook University. She researches how and why hydrothermal ore deposits form in shear zones using numerical modelling combined with extensive fieldwork and microstructural analysis, focusing on North Queensland mineral deposits. So after her wildly popular animation, it is going to be awesome to get her insights today about a mechanism for ore deposit formation during tectonic switching. So strap yourselves in. It's going to be a great session. Please keep using the chat. We'll open up the floor at the end. And thank you so much, Mel, for joining. It's amazing having you here.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. I've been to a lot of GeoHug seminars over the years, so it's wonderful to be here myself delivering one. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming along. So what I'm going to tell you about today is a work in progress for me. So I've got a little way down the road with these ideas already, but I'm going to be working on this for the next few years. So it's really great to talk to this audience about these ideas. And yeah, so I am a structural geologist and I specialise in ductile shear zones. I do some other stuff as well, but ductile shear zones are my favourite thing to be working on. And I've sort of come up with this idea about a mechanism for forming hydrothermal ore deposits during tectonic switches. So times when tectonic boundaries go from extension to shortening, or vice versa, from shortening to extension. So I'll kick it off by talking a little bit about ductile shear zones. So we talk a lot, about in sort of economic geology about faults, brittle faults, and we also talk about ductile shears, but don't always mean the same thing. So brittle faults are these shallow structures that occur in the upper crust, and we are really interested in these because they are often the site of ore deposits as well, and I will be talking a little bit about those today. But what I'm interested in particular is these zones of distributed sort of but focused deformation that occur at deeper levels within the crust. So this is where rocks can flow instead of breaking. And so we often talk about shears, and these can be like brittle shears, radial shears, these sorts of, that form up here in the shallower levels, but really these broad zones of ductile deformation occur at a higher sort of metamorphic grade in the middle to lower crust. So that's the zone that I'm interested in. But where I'm going to start today is talking about a process that occurs in the upper crust. And so this is work on how orogenic gold deposits form that several people have been doing over many years. So there's Simpson and Steve Cox and Steve Micklethwaite. So fair few people have been contributing to this model of the formation of orogenic gold deposits. So I've got this schematic diagram over here, and what you can see here is that we've got, this sort of shows in a general way the way that orogenic gold deposits form. So we start off, in a source rock at a deep sort of level, perhaps more than 30 k's or so, and a fluid is generated. In this case, a metamorphic fluid is generated. That fluid finds a ligand. The ligand finds gold, and then that ore-bearing fluid, that gold-bearing fluid, finds a channel wave. And so this is a fault that is in kilometres in scale, so, tens of kilometres in scale. Then in the shallow crust, on second and third order structures, the gold deposit forms. And the place where this gold deposit forms is often on structures that look like this one here. So here we have a big quartz vein, and within this quartz vein, we have different layers. And for those who enjoy determining kinematics from extensional veins, you may have spotted these features off to the side here. So these horizontal extensional or tensional veins tell us that this fault is a reverse fault. And so it's quite a steep reverse fault. And that actually is something that's quite common in orogenic gold deposits, that we have these reverse faults that are quite steep. But that's actually unusual. So because the way that faults actually form means that you don't normally get steep reverse faults. So these faults are misoriented. So the way that rocks accommodate stress means that faults normally form at about 30 degrees from the maximum compressional stress. So in an underformed rock, that fault will form at that sort of angle. And because the maximum compressional stress is different for extension and for shortening, that means that normal faults that form during, normal faults often have very steep dips of 60 degrees, and reverse faults usually have shallow dips of about 30 degrees. But what we see in orogenic gold deposits is we have these steep reverse faults. So instead of being at 30 degrees, they're much steeper angles. And so this is an exciting puzzle. Well, it was until it kind of got figured out. So why mineralization occurs on these faults that are steeper and misoriented. So the model for how these things form, or why these things form, is that we start off, D1, you have some shortening, and a fault nucleates, reverse fault nucleates an angle of about 30 degrees. With a dip of about 30 degrees. And then that fault rotates to become steeper, perhaps during prolonged deformation or some other reason. And so it becomes steeper. And then there's another event, another deformation event, and in this sort of orientation. And this fault is misoriented for this deformation event, so it won't reactivate, it won't rupture. So around this fault, there may be other faults that are at shallower orientations that will rupture, but this fault here will not rupture. And so what happens then is that fluid builds up in the system, and this buildup of fluid around this fault that won't rupture increases the fluid pressure around the fault. And eventually the fluid pressure gets so high that it exceeds the lithostatic strength of the rock, and the fault ruptures. And so when the fault ruptures, these fluids have been at very high pressure, and there's a large volume of fluid, it's built up over time. And so these sorts of characteristics are what leads to the formation of orogenic gold deposits. And so we see that misoriented faults with a long history of reactivation are common hosts of gold deposits, orogenic gold deposits like this. And so Simpson and Steve Cox and others have put this into a model, the fault valve model for orogenic gold deposits. And so what they say is you have this fault rupture event that happens after the stress is sort of built up in the system. And so the fault ruptures, fluids move through the fault, and quartz and gold precipitate in the fault. Then the fault becomes sealed. So when the fault is sealed, then no fluids can move through it again. And so the same process happens again. So stress builds up around the fault, and eventually it exceeds the lithostatic strength of the rock, and then it ruptures again. And so you get a number of different events over time, maybe hundreds or more, that slowly build up this gold deposit over time. And in fact, all of these different layers, you can see there's sort of wall rock in here, and then quartz vein, then wall rock. So they're all different events, different rupture events, and each rupture event is an earthquake. So so the fault becomes sealed and the fluid pressure builds up again. So that's the fault valve model for orogenic gold deposits. And so there's been quite a lot of work done on that. But I wondered, what happens when ductile shear zones are misoriented? So all of this stuff that they've been working on is looking at these brittle faults. What about down here? What about when ductile shear zones are in the wrong orientation to reactivate? What happens then? So let's have a look at these ductile shear zones in a bit more detail. So here's an example from Spain on the Mediterranean, which is a nice place to do field work. And so here we have a granodiorite, and there's a leucocratic dike that cuts through, and you can see that the dike is offset on either side of this shear zone. And there's another shear zone down here as well. And if we zoom in on that, you can see that what happens to minerals within these shear zones is they become really stretched out. So here's the starting rock up here, and you can see that it's sort of equigranular, and then down here everything has been sheared. You can see that they've got these these dark layers of biotite that have joined up together, whereas here there's no sort of layering, and we've got these lozenge shaped grains, crystals as well. So with ductile shear zones, yeah, the minerals undergo deformation inside the actual crystals. And so the way that these zones deform is that you have a shear zone that starts moving, so dextral shear zone that we have here, and we've got the shear zone boundary there. And even though this is sort of dextral shear, what there is zones of stretching, or orientations of stretching and of shortening. So the first thing to happen within shear zones when they start to deform is that we form these things called S-planes, and they form parallel to this sort of greatest sort of stretching axis there. So these S-planes nucleate at about 45 degrees from the shear zone boundary, and then all the time we've got this rotation of things within the shear zone. So they rotate over, and then eventually they become parallel to the shear zone boundary and become C-planes. And that's sort of one way you can form SC fabric in a shear zone, which perhaps many of you have seen before in these ductile shear zones. And this is just one example of a structure that forms in shear zones. There are lots of different structures that form in these zones, and we won't be going through these today, but it's just one of many. So shear zones are very interesting because they are sites of ore deposits. So we see that often shear zones are the host of mineral deposits, and here I've pulled out a few in the eastern fold belt, the Mount Isa Inlier in Queensland. So we've got the Starra deposits that formed along the Starra Shear, and then we've got a number of different shear zones along here. And so sometimes these ore deposits form actually within the shear zone. And then in other places like Mary Kathleen and Ernest Henry, the shear zones are adjacent to the ore deposit. So these are really interesting areas for trying to understand sort of what happens to form an ore deposit. And we already kind of have some thoughts about this, or there's this sort of traditional model of why these sorts of ore deposits form in shear zones. And that kind of is broadly just generally that shear zones are fluid conduits. So here we have a shear zone here in this sort of stripy layer here, and this is a really deformed version of this rock here. And you can sort of see that the mineralogy looks to be similar. But the fluid flow rates in these layers, in this sheared layer, is much higher than through a rock that is undeformed. So this rock is not undeformed, you can see a foliation in it, but in an undeformed rock, the fluid flow rates would be as little as 1 to 2 centimeters for every million years, whereas in this deformed rock, the fluid flow rates can be as high as hundreds of cubic kilometers per million years. And that is the sort of fluid flux you need to form a hydrothermal ore deposit. So these things are, and so because they're such good fluid conduits, that is thought to be part of the reason why they host these ore deposits. So these zones are really interesting when you drill down into them. So this layering is called foliation. So they're strongly foliated, and within this, there are actually layers that are higher strain rate and lower strain rate. So when I say strain rate, you can just think about it, the rate that the rock is deforming is higher and lower in different sections of this shear zone. And I'll show you what I mean a bit more by that a bit later. And so because there are different deformation rates or different strain rates within these rocks, it also means that there's different stresses. So some layers are higher stress and some layers are lower stress. And fluids actually migrate in response to stress gradients or response to pressure gradients, mean pressure gradients. And so these sorts of gradients are actually facilitating fluid movement through these shear zones. And in fact, sometimes the fluid flow can be so strongly channelized by these shear zones that the adjacent wall rock might not see any fluid whatsoever. So we can have very highly metasomatized shear zones next to rock that is completely unaltered. That's how good they are at channeling fluids. Yeah, so they can protect other rocks from experiencing that. So I, looked at a lot of shear zones in lots of different places, and we can understand that this shear zone formed from this rock here, and that's okay. But I kind of wondered why, like, and how, right? How do you get a shear zone from an unformed? What are the stages of deformation? And so I started doing this numerical modeling technique, which can kind of tell us exactly how, in a mechanical way, how these shear zones evolve. So the platform is called L, and in L you start off with a microstructure. You can draw any microstructure that you like. I like this one because it sort of looks a bit like a igneous rock. And so here I've got lots of grains, and the grains, when you zoom in, they're actually just nodes that are joined by straight lines. And so these are B nodes or boundary nodes. And then behind these nodes, behind these grains, is this network of U nodes, so unconnected nodes. And those are really cool because they store information about the strain rate and the stress. So what I can do is get this starting microstructure and deform it and see what happens to the strain rate and the stress during deformation. So the way that L works is that you have this, this square starting microstructure, and then during simple shearing, things are sheared, in this case, off to the right. The top of the model sheared off to the right, and then stuff leaves the model through this side, and then it's brought back, over to the other side over here. So we get repositioning, and so we've got these wrapping grain boundaries. If you're into coding, then the code behind this is a full field viscoplastic deformation code, but we won't go into that today. So what does this code do? Well, it actually deforms the model the same way as how a real rock deforms, in a mechanical sense. So what we have in here, the different colors are different minerals. And these different minerals actually have different models, and the models emulate sort of the model of these real crystals. So in real minerals, there are different slip surfaces within the crystal, and each of these slip surfaces has a different strength. And so the resistance of each of these slip systems to deformation is known as this critical resolve shear stress. So basically what that means for the modeling is that I have, a mineral, so this white mineral here, and it has a mineral model. And in that mineral model, I can specify the strength of each slip system. So it deforms like a real rock does. And so what we can do is go, okay, well, this rock here, so this is quite strongly sheared, and there are different minerals here that have different strengths. So there's micas down here, and there's a strong feldspar here that's undergoing brittle fracture, and there's quartz in here that's doing something different. And so we can have those three different minerals in the model and see how the rock deforms. So that's what I've done in the models that I'm showing you. So that I've got a grey mineral here, which is a strong phase like feldspar is over here. A white mineral, that's quartz. It's got the same crystal structure as quartz. And then a black mineral, which is a weak phase like a mica down here. And with the modeling, I'm doing simple shear in steps, and each step is a small increment of deformation, and these build up over time to get to like a finite strain. So this is after 18 steps, but normally do more like 1,000 steps and see what happens to the rock. So now I'm going to start showing you some models. And so this first one is just showing you how shear zones develop in these multi-phase rocks or three-phase rocks here. So we've got a strong phase in grey, intermediate strength phase in white, and a weak phase in black. And the weak phase, it has a weak basal plane, like a mica. Micas have this weak basal plane, so it's emulating that sort of thing. Over on this side, I'm going to show you strain rate that evolves at the same time as this model does. And so strain rate goes from high to low, and you can think about strain rate as like the rate of deformation. So high areas are accommodating a lot of the deformation, and dark blue areas are accommodating nothing or close to nothing. Okay, so let's have a look. All right, so what you're going to see is the first thing to happen to this microstructure over here is that things are stretching out in this direction, about 45 degrees from the shear zone boundary. So there's those S-planes that I told you about at the start, so S-planes. And then we get the rotation of some of those S-planes to parallelism with the shear zone boundary, forming C-planes, and so we end up with this SC fabric. And so we also see other things like C prime planes, for those who are into shear zones and know about that, and these lozenges. So what you start to see is like, wow, that actually just looks a lot like a shear zone. It looks a lot like what you see in the field. So you have these lozenge shaped sigma class. We even form delta class in some of the models, and lots of planes. But the cool thing here is that you can see how strain rate evolves at the same time. So what's happening over here is that these dark layers of weak phase, they're linking up into long layers. And as they link up, they localize more of the strain rate, more of the deformation. And so we see increasing strain localization, deformation localization, with increasing finite strain or increasing sort of time, or yeah. And you can see also some asymmetric folds in here as well. Yeah, so if you are interested in watching more of these models, I've got a whole heap of them on my website, so you can always go there and take a look if you like. And in this particular model, we develop a shear zone within the shear zone that's accommodating all the strain. So yeah, it's that develops over time, but then strain sort of delocalizes a bit more later on. So anyway, so that's how shear zones develop as a mechanical model only. So it's not looking at recrystallization or anything like that. Okay, so back to our ore deposits. So yes, we see ore deposits are forming in shear zones like the one that I just showed you. So let's look at a photo from one of those. This is from the E1 deposit. In the work by Case et al. In 2018. And what you can see here is we have this vein, this quartz layer here, and it is boudinaged. So you can see that it is pinching and swelling. And in those boudin necks is where the chalcopyrite and pyrite veins have mineralized. And this is telling us that this mineralization occurred during deformation, because these are low pressure sites, but they're only low pressure sites during deformation. You can also see, yeah, fluorite, it's good ligand in the fold here as well. So what the evidence we see in places like this and other ore deposits in the Mount Isa inlier is that mineralization is occurring during deformation. This is another example of a Monikoff deposit, not quite as easy to see, but here we've got an ore zone right in the middle of a shear zone. Here's a hang wall and the footwall. And so, yeah, that's just another example. So the cool thing for me about all these shear zones, when you go through the literature, you start to realize that they all have one thing in common, and that is that they have this long history. So all of these ore deposits have formed in shear zones that had an early history, and then the mineralization occurred like later in the history in a different deformation event. And sometimes what we see is extension overprinted by shortening in these shear zones, and sometimes it's shortening overprinted by extension. So actually, when you go through the literature, it can happen either way, which is really interesting, because that speaks to sort of, genetic models as well. You have to have something, well, the simplest model for this is something that can explain both situations. So we have, so got just two cartoons here where we have, in this case, a D1 extension, and during extension, we're forming a number of faults and shear zones at depth. These are normal faults and normal shear zones at depth. And then during D2 shortening, the same structures tend to be reused, but the shear sense or the shear direction is inverted. So same structures, but moving the opposite way. So I wanted to know what happens to rocks during that process, and what happens to fluid flow is what I eventually want to get to during that process. So let's have a look. I did some new models to look at this, and this time what we have is here we've got a sort of a layered rock. So we've got strong phase and intermediate strength phase out here, and then in this layer only is the weak phase. So this layer will be weaker than the sort of rock outside it. On this side, we've got stress. So the The stress again goes from high to low. So I want to, with this model, to look at what happens to stress during shear reversal. So what we're going to do is start by shearing under dextral shear, and then the model will switch and go to sinistral shear. So those dextral shearing structures will develop, and then we'll see what happens to them as they go back the other way. Now this moves quite fast, and I'm going to be talking quite quickly, but then I will step through what happens afterwards, so you don't have to worry about that. So same as what we saw before. So elongation at 45 degrees from the shear zone boundary, forming S-planes, and then it forms SC fabric. And you can see that, a lot of deformation occurring in this weak layer through here. And we can see where we've got high stress over here, where we've got red, so that was the reversal, it's now going back the other way. High stress here is in this zone, this weaker zone. And so what happens here is we get the rotation of the SC fabric anti-clockwise, and then it folds. So we're forming lots of folds in here that you might be able to make out. And then those folds get stretched out and form isoclinal folds, then isoclinal rootless folds, and then eventually the structures are completely transposed to that new direction, that sinistral direction of shearing. And eventually you're not able to tell that there ever was a pre-existing stage of dextral shearing. It all looks like sinistral shearing. So that's the way that things evolve there. Okay, so what happened in slow motion? This is what we saw happening there. So we start off with, dextral shearing, and at the end of the dextral shearing, we've got a microstructure that looks like this. So a nice SC fabric that you can see there, and you can see in here as well. Then sinistral shearing starts, so the opposite direction of shearing. And when that happens, these S-planes in here, they rotate backward, or they rotate counterclockwise, and so become steeper. So it started like this and it becomes steeper. When these rotate backwards and become steeper, they actually enter the shortening field of deformation. So the shortening field for sinistral shearing is in this orientation. So when they enter that maximum shortening direction, that means they fold, these S-planes fold. So form a number of folds through here like this. And first of all, they sort of start off in these sort of more symmetrical shapes, but then they quickly become asymmetrical with more shearing. So as shearing continues, then the folds tighten and rotate, and eventually the axial planes become parallel to the shear zone boundary. So, and then after that, they become transposed. So you might be able to pull out little fold hinges in here. It's a little bit hard to see. I've spent a lot of time staring at these things. So they get completely pulled apart, and then so we end up with little fold hinges that don't have limbs, and we get a fold transposition to the shear planes. And then eventually sinistral SC fabric forms from this microstructure, and and so you can't even tell that there ever was a stage of dextral shearing beforehand. Now, the thing I guess to point out here is, so here we've got a really nice layering. So we've developed those weak planes, those weak phase layers, and that that they partition the strain rate, so they partition deformation, and so a nice sort of fabric. And through a fabric like this, it is pretty easy to move fluids because everything is connected, and we have high and low strain rate layers, high and low stress layers. But when the microstructure gets this, then all of that the layering within this rock is destroyed, or the shape is changed by this folds, and it continues to change shape as the shear zone evolves through these stages. Now, I've talked about steps here, and that probably that doesn't mean anything to you, but what that is a few million years at normal strain rates. So these changes are occurring over a few million years. Okay, so we can also have a look at what happens to stress, so stress, as this change is taking place. Now, in a shear zone, when you start shearing a rock, the stress is high because there's nothing in the rock that is lined up properly to accommodate that shearing. So stress is high, and as things link up and you get structures that can accommodate the shearing, then the stress decreases as as those structures develop. So the stress was nicely decreasing here, but then there was a switch in the shearing direction. So a sudden change in shearing direction from dextral shearing to sinistral shearing. And so you can see here that what happens is the stress goes up. So there's a big increase in stress after this switch to sinistral shearing. And that's because all those structures that were accommodating the shearing in this easy kind of way are not oriented correctly for sinistral shearing. So they're facing sort of the opposite direction to what they need to be facing to accommodate sinistral shearing. And there needs to be a reorientation of the microstructure or of the structure to accommodate this new direction of shearing. So there's this big increase in stress after the switch. Now, that stress increase persists for the entire time that transposition is taking place. So until we get that nice SC fabric for sinistral shearing and transposition is complete, the stress remains high. And remember that I said that's millions of years. That's a couple of million years that stress is remaining high. And after transposition is complete, like you can see down here, then there's a big stress decrease after those structures have reoriented. So what does this mean? Well, what the whole point of trying to do this is trying to understand what happens in shear zones during tectonic switches. So we have shear zones that are misoriented for the new direction of shearing, and we want to understand what happens to them during reorientation, because it turns out that all these ore deposits that form in shear zones form at exactly the moment of tectonic switches. So when you date them, we date the ore deposits, they form during these times of tectonic switches. So what is it about the tectonic switch, that switch from extension to shortening or shortening to extension, that is causing mineralization? Well, it could be related to how this microstructure develops. So during D1, just say it's extension, we've got a high fluid flux through these shear zones, through this deforming layered rock. So during D1 normal shearing, we've got this blue zone here is the shear zone, and this pale cream color is the host rock. And so we've got a shear zone that is at low stress because it's well oriented for accommodating the deformation. And there's a high strain rate, a high deformation rate within here. And there's a high fluid content. So fluids can quite happily move through these zones and move quite quickly through here. In the host rock, there is a low strain rate, so a low rate of deformation because all the deformation is occurring in here. And there's a low fluid content. So shear zones are such good fluid conduits that they protect the rock outside the shear zone from experiencing fluid or alteration in a lot of cases. Okay, so during D2, then we get this inversion of the shear zone. So we go from shearing one way to shearing in the opposite direction. So as you just saw, when that happens, we get these weird structures that form. And I say weird because when you see these in a shear zone out in the field, there's the sorts of things that you go, oh, I don't really understand what that means. I'm just going to keep walking. And we always walk past these zones because they are quite complex. Those structures that you saw in the model, they actually happen in real rocks. I've seen them, in real rocks as well in a number of different shear zones. And so, they're really complicated zones. So yes, when that foliation is destroyed and that nice SC fabric is destroyed and folded, we see this increase in stress within the shear zone, and of course a much lower strain rate, a much lower rate of deformation here because these structures are not favorably oriented to accommodate this new shearing direction. And so here, because there's higher stress in here, there's a pressure increase in here. If the pressure in here becomes higher than the pressure out here, or the stress out here, then it can actually expel the fluids from the shear zone to the host rock. So the fluids can migrate from the shear zone into the host rock. And remember that this hasn't seen much fluid flux before, so it hasn't seen fluids before. And so all these metals that are out here, they're just waiting to be scavenged by this fluid. So the host rock experiences this increased fluid content. Now, when the transposition to thrusting, in this case, is complete, then the shear zone becomes low stress again. It can again accommodate a high strain rate and a high fluid content. So it becomes this low stress site would attract fluids into it from the surrounding rocks. And so fluids are sort of sucked back into the shear zone. Now, from here, it's possible that this process, I guess, could form an ore deposit, but it's also just a way of getting an ore fluid back into a shear zone, and that fluid can then be transported up the shear zone to a structurally favorable site for deposition and ore deposit formation. So that's the idea there. Now, the problem with this numerical models is that you can't actually put fluids into them. So we can see what's happening mechanically to the structures, but we're actually not able to see what's happening to the fluids directly, and it can be really complex. And so the next steps in this work is that we're going to go to the synchrotron in November. So I've actually got rocks that are from shear zones where you could see this transposition. So you've got a dextral shear zone that's partially overprinted by a sinistral shear zone, and then you keep sort of walking in, and then you get to eventually to a zone where it's completely sinistral shear. So exactly this sort of evolution that I've outlined in the models. So with those rocks, we can go to the synchrotron and have a look at the porosity and look at whether this change in structure during these reactivation or tectonic switching events actually causes a change in the porosity. So what you can see here in this model is from another paper, and they've got here all the pores are outlined there in red, and you can see that they line up these pores, they form sort of pore sheets, and what we'll be able to do is see how the distribution of porosity changes and see how the permeability of that porosity changes during these switching events. So that's sort of the next step. So there's also another sort of prong to this research, which is looking, of course, at mineralized shear zones from North Queensland. So I've got a few different PhD students and honours students working on shear zone hosted deposits in northern Queensland. So if you have a shear zone hosted deposit that you work in or that you know of, particularly one that's got funky structures, strange structures that are hard to understand, I'd love to hear about it, because I have this big project starting, well, it's sort of already started, but I get the money for it starting next year. So I'm doing a lot more work in this area. Yep, so that is it from me, and I'd love to take your questions.
Thank you so much. That was brilliantly presented. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that.